Amina did not often visit her uncle. Her parents had always thought of him as a strange man, one with whom it was better to keep a distance. Samson's mother, the younger sister, only averted her eyes when it came to her brother. His father didn't like him at all and preferred not to remember him. Samson had been living in seclusion for a long time, somewhere on the outskirts, away from the hustle and bustle of the city, in his old house surrounded by thickets of trees, already almost absorbed by nature. This place has always seemed strange and frightening to Amina, but at the same time attractive, perhaps because she knew only superficially about him, and what was unknown always attracted her. This time she came to him at the insistence of her mother, who suddenly wanted to establish a relationship with her brother, or at least start them, even through his daughter. Amina, without much resistance, agreed. The road to my uncle's house was long and boring. Her thoughts wandered as the car, which had served its time, slowly rolled along the dusty road. There were questions in her head that she couldn't answer. Why were her parents avoiding this man so much? Why is she so worried about the upcoming communication with him? When she finally pulled up to the old house, her heart sank for a moment. The place really looked abandoned, a sagging fence covered with wild grapes, overgrown weeds by the porch, and dilapidated paint on the walls. All this indicated that his master had long since stopped worrying about the appearance of his monastery. However, something inside pulled her further. Amina got out of the car, carefully closing the door, and hesitantly walked to the porch. The sound of her heels echoed in the void. It seemed like the house hadn't heard anyone else's footsteps for a long time. Suddenly the front door creaked, and Samson appeared on the threshold. He looked older than she remembered from his childhood photos. His grey hair had long since lost its former colour, and his wrinkled face was marked by traces of time and hard life. However, in his eyes, despite the years he had lived, there was a strange, almost childish spark, as if he could see something that others did not notice. It was the look that immediately caught Amina's attention and made her freeze for a moment.
"Hi, Uncle Samson,"
she said awkwardly, not knowing how to start a conversation. Samson just nodded, silently inviting her inside. The house inside turned out to be more cozy than it looked from the outside. The furniture, though old-fashioned, still retained a certain charm. Wooden shelves lined with books, an antique clock with a pendulum, ringing with its measured ticking, and upholstered chairs placed around a small table, created an atmosphere of comfort and tranquility. But that wasn't what caught Amina's attention. Her gaze involuntarily swept over the owner of the house. He moved slowly, as if every movement required effort from him, but his posture still retained a certain grandeur. He lived here as if he was cut off from the whole world, as if this house had become his personal fortress, protecting him from the surrounding chaos.
"Your mother hasn't been here for a long time."
Samson finally said, his voice hoarse but confident.
"And I haven't seen you for a long time."
Amina felt an uneasiness spreading in her chest. Yes, it was their first conversation in many years. Previously, they had met only briefly on family holidays, where he was always shunned, and she was too busy with childish worries to pay attention to this silent man. Now he stood in front of her, mysterious and distant.
"She's very busy.
Amina managed, realizing how pathetic that sounded.
Work, family, children."
Samson nodded again, silently, as if her words didn't matter. His gaze returned to her again, as if he was looking not just at her, but through her, seeing something that remained hidden from prying eyes. This look made Amina feel uncomfortable, but at the same time, a strange feeling arose inside, which she could not immediately recognize. It was more than just curiosity or anxiety. It was as if this man, unknown to her despite his family ties, had suddenly become the center of her own thoughts.
"How long do you plan to stay here? What is it?"
he asked after a short pause, sobering her with his question.
"A week, maybe. I'm not sure. Mum wants me to. We'll get to know you better."
She swallowed the end of the sentence, feeling how ridiculous it sounded. But how else could she explain her presence here? Samson didn't laugh or grin. He just shrugged and turned to the window, where he had a view of the dense foliage of the trees, through which the sun's rays barely penetrated. Amina felt even more awkward. It seemed that he was so far away from her that any word uttered in his presence would have lost all meaning.
"This house has seen a lot.
He finally said, without taking his eyes off the window.
People come and go, but here everything remains the same. And you, Amina, what brings you here? Is it only your mother's wish?"
His voice was calm, but there was something else in it, a certain depth that she couldn't immediately grasp. It was a question that required an honest answer, but Amina herself did not know what to answer. Her mind was a mess of thoughts and contradictions. She began, but stopped. She didn't know how to put into words what she couldn't understand herself. Why did she agree to come? What prompted her to take this step? She tried to find an answer, but everything was like a fog. Samson turned to her, looked at her intently, and that look penetrated deep inside her. She felt her heart racing.
"Don't worry,"
he said, as if he could hear her thoughts.
"Everything will become clear in time. The questions you ask yourself sometimes don't require immediate answers."
He turned away and slowly walked over to the chair, sitting down in it with a heavy sigh. Amina followed his example and sat down opposite him, nervously clasping her fingers in her lap. Silence hung in the room, but it was not oppressive. On the contrary, it was filled with some new, strange meaning. Something stirred inside Amina, as if an invisible spring had suddenly tightened, preparing to unclench at any moment. Samson didn't speak anymore, and she didn't want to break this silent harmony. She sat there, feeling the presence of this man, mysterious, distant, but at the same time attractive. Everything she had known up to that moment seemed distant and unimportant now. Here, in this old house, in Samson's presence, her thoughts gradually began to take on a different form. She no longer felt the anxiety that had plagued her on the way here. In its place came something else that she couldn't identify yet. A week has passed since Amina moved into her uncle's house. Time seemed to have stopped here, in this abandoned place, far from the hustle and bustle of the city. The days passed unnoticed, each of them resembled the previous one, but at the same time was filled with hidden tension, which increased every day. Samson was a man of few words, and their conversations boiled down to short phrases, discussing the minutiae of everyday life or rare comments about the weather. However, there was something more in those few words, something unspoken, but powerful, as if their every word, every action harbored deep subtexts. Amina became more and more immersed in this strange state, when words lost their meaning, giving way to an invisible connection that grew between them. Every morning started the same way. Amina got up at dawn and went out on the porch of the house to breathe in the cool, humid air of the forest. The mist that enveloped the trees gave everything a mystical look. Sometimes it seemed to her that she had entered another world, where everything was subject to different laws. She found herself thinking that she liked this state, when reality seemed to be distorted, and her uncle's house became for her something like a refuge from the whole outside world. Samson appeared later. He never said what he did in the morning, but his presence was always felt. Amina could feel his footsteps behind her, even if he didn't make a sound. His shadow fell on her, barely noticeable, but tangible. They rarely had breakfast together, each preferred their own privacy in the morning. But it was this solitude, this silent ritual, that brought them closer and closer. Her life began to adjust to his rhythm, and she, without noticing it, began to look for his presence in every corner of the house. One day, in the late afternoon, when the sun was already setting, Amina decided to go for a walk in the overgrown garden behind the house. She loved this place. The lush greenery, intertwined tree branches and wildflowers created an atmosphere of wild, untamed nature. This time, gliding through the thickets, she suddenly came across an old gazebo that she had not noticed before. It was half overgrown with peeling paint, but it still stood, as if alive among the dense foliage. Amina came closer, touched the cool metal handrails, and suddenly felt that she was not alone here. Turning around, she saw Samson. He stood at the edge of the garden, watching her with the same look that had haunted her since the first day. But now there was something else in that look, something deeper, not just curiosity or concern.
Do you come here often?
Amina asked, trying to control her excitement. Samson approached slowly, his footsteps barely audible on the soft grass. He didn't answer right away, but his presence said more than any words.
"Once upon a time, a long time ago, I came here.
He finally said, stopping next to me.
Then this place was alive. Now everything has changed."
He was looking at the garden, but Amina felt that his words were about something more. Her heart began to beat faster. There was a strange tension building in her chest that she couldn't explain. It was as if something invisible connected them, something that had been born a long time ago, but only now began to manifest itself.
But why don't you come here anymore? What is it?
She asked, turning to him. Samson was silent for a moment before answering.
"Time does its job. What used to be important loses its meaning over time.
His words hung in the air, and Amina felt a strange sense of loss come over her, although she couldn't figure out what exactly. It seemed to her that with every day she spent here, she was losing a part of herself, giving it to this place and this person. But this loss did not frighten her. On the contrary, she felt a strange craving that grew in her, filling the void. A few more days passed. Their morning silences had become something familiar, but this silence was far from empty. More and more often, Amina found herself thinking of Samson not just as an uncle, but as a man who strangely influenced her consciousness. His words, his actions, even his looks left traces that she couldn't get rid of. One evening, as she sat at the window of her room, watching the sun slowly sink below the horizon, Amina suddenly caught herself thinking that she was no longer afraid of this man. On the contrary, she was attracted to him like a magnet. It was something irrational that she couldn't explain. Another morning, Amina, as always, woke up at dawn and went out on the porch. This time Samson was already there, leaning on the railing and looking into the distance. She came up to him, but was silent. He was the first to break the silence.
I feel like you're getting cramped here already,
he said, without taking his eyes off the forest. Amina flinched slightly at his words. She really started to feel something like that, but she couldn't explain it. It was as if her thoughts and feelings had merged into one whole, and this whole was trying to get out somewhere, break through.
Is it crowded? What is it?
She asked, not knowing how to answer correctly. Samson turned to her, and she saw something in his eyes that she couldn't explain, as if his gaze penetrated right into her soul.
Do you want to leave?
He asked. The question caught her off guard. She didn't think about leaving, but his words made her think again. Perhaps it was a warning, perhaps it was a suggestion. But something inside her rejected the idea. She was comfortable here, next to him, despite everything.
No.
She finally answered, her voice sounding more confident than she expected.
I don't want to leave.
His face remained calm, but there was a slight gleam of surprise in his eyes.
Then stay,
he said, turning back to the forest. But be prepared for the fact that life here can change you. His words sounded like a warning again, but Amina felt that they meant something more. This house, this man, has already begun to change her. She didn't know what it would lead to, but it didn't scare her anymore. She could feel invisible threads stretching between them, binding them tighter and tighter. And one night, when the silence in the house was especially deep, and the sounds of the forest seemed distant, as if from another world, Amina woke up from the fact that the room was too stuffy. She got up and quietly went out onto the porch to get some fresh air. Samson was there again. He was sitting on the porch, looking up at the night sky. She came closer and sat down next to him. They didn't say a word. They just sat next to each other, and something invisible but tangible slipped between them. At some point, their hands accidentally touched, and Amina felt a slight tremor run through her body. She didn't pull her hand away. Samson didn't move either. This innocent gesture seemed to negate all boundaries between them. That night, something changed completely. Their connection has become not just a hidden craving or tacit understanding, it has become something real, tangible. They couldn't ignore it anymore, no matter how hard they tried. Every step they took, every look and every touch now carried a new meaning. This was the beginning of something that none of them could have predicted. Time continued to run its course. A week turned into a month, and Amina could no longer imagine her life outside these walls, outside this secluded silence, away from the noise and worries of the outside world. She even stopped counting the days. Each of them was like a new one. As if torn from reality and existing only within the boundaries of this house, this garden, this eternal forest shadow. Everything was closed, as if time was floating here in its own special flow, separated from everything that had happened before. The relationship between Amina and Samson has now become a different level of silence, that silence in which there is no need for words. Their mutual understanding grew out of gestures, glances, casual touches, which now ceased to be accidental. If they had previously avoided each other in the morning, each living in their own little shell, now they were looking for this presence. Amina noticed that Samson was always nearby as if by accident, but it was a strange feeling. She knew he was there, even if she didn't see him. She felt it the way you feel the warmth of another person, even when you're in a separate room. They were spending more time together now, and although their conversations were still short and terse, there was a story in every word they said. Their every evening became a kind of ritual, After dinner, they would go out on the porch, sit next to each other and just be silent, watching the forest absorb the evening light, as the world around their little shelter plunged into silence. It was their form of communication, silent, but full of meaning. One day, when the warm summer evening was giving way to night, Amina and Samson were sitting side by side on the porch again. Her gaze slid over his profile, illuminated by the soft light of the moon, and her heart stopped for a moment. Now she couldn't ignore what had settled in her soul for a long time. He was no longer just her uncle. This man, who seemed distant, secretive and mysterious, suddenly became the one who filled her thoughts completely. He was now inseparable from her inner world. Amina looked down at her hands, clasping them in the lock, trying to hide the trembling that she could not explain. Her mind tried to resist, but her body and heart had long since defied logic. They lived in their own rhythm, driven by this strange craving that was increasingly gripping her.
Aren't you scared?
Samson asked suddenly, his voice cutting through the silence as if he was reading her mind. Amina was startled by his question. Her gaze darted to him, but he was still looking into the distance, as if his question was directed not so much to her as to himself.
Is it scary? What is it?
She asked, trying to figure out exactly what he meant. Samson turned his head towards her, and their eyes met. In his eyes she saw the same silence that had surrounded them since the first day of her arrival. But now there was something else in that silence, painful, deep, unpronounceable. Her heart sank at that look.
Aren't you scared here with me?
He repeated, but this time his words sounded softer, as if they were hiding not just anxiety, but a confession of something much more. Amina was silent, not knowing what to say. Fear. She stopped feeling fear a long time ago. Everything she was experiencing right now was far beyond what that word could describe. The fear was mixed with something else, deeper and more incomprehensible. She didn't know what to say, so she just reached out and touched his palm. Her fingers gently slid over his skin, and she felt a current flow through her body. Samson didn't take his hand away. Their touch lasted only a few seconds, but those seconds were enough for something to change between them. It was a tacit admission that both of them had understood for a long time, but they couldn't say it out loud. After that, their days flowed differently. They no longer hid from each other, no longer tried to keep their distance. Their interaction moved to another level, a level where there was no room for words. Amina felt like every step she took was now filled with expectation. She could no longer imagine this house without Samson. Every time their eyes met, it was like a flash, a moment in which her whole being shrank into one longing to be closer to him. One night, when the rain was falling with such force that the windows rattled hollowly under its blows, Amina could not sleep. Her thoughts kept returning to Samson. She got out of bed, put on a bathrobe and left her room. As she walked through the dark corridors, illuminated only by the dim light of the lamps, she felt a strange excitement. It was a feeling she couldn't explain, as if she was being pulled somewhere she couldn't resist. When she reached the door of his room, she stopped. My heart was pounding so hard in my chest that it seemed like it was about to burst out. She didn't have to explain to herself why she was here. She knew that. Without thinking any more, she knocked softly. There was no response. Then she cautiously opened the door and entered. Samson was sitting on the bed, as if he was waiting for her. The lamplight cast shadows on his face, making him even more mysterious. Their eyes met, and at that moment everything became very clear. There was no more fear, no more doubt. It was something that had been maturing between them for a long time and was now just looking for a way out. Amina slowly approached him, not looking away. Samson didn't move either, just looked at her with the same silent understanding that had been between them from the very beginning. She sat down next to him, and silence hung in the air again, but this time it was a different silence. It was their mutual recognition. Her hand found his again. Samson did not resist. He gently lifted her hand to his lips and gently touched it. It was a gesture that made more sense than any spoken word. They didn't talk anymore. There was no need. Everything that had happened between them became very clear. After that night, everything changed. Their relationship went beyond silent touching and looking. They could no longer ignore how they felt about each other. It was inevitable, like the sunset that comes every evening, even if you don't want to see it. Their secret romance began to grow like wildfire. It was a hidden passion that flared up in every look, every touch. They tried not to show their feelings openly, although there was no one in the house who could see them. But there was still this strange caution, as if their relationship was something forbidden. something that could not be spoken out loud. They met in secret, as if they were afraid to destroy this fragile illusion of their world. Samson still remained silent and reserved, but now there was a certain depth in his gaze that Amina had learned to understand. They became a part of each other, an inseparable but hidden part. Amina increasingly noticed how her perception of time and space had changed. She no longer felt like the girl who had come here a few weeks ago. She was different now. This house, this man, had changed her, made her a part of this strange, prolonged dream. Every day she spent here took her further away from the reality that had once been important to her. She no longer thought about what would happen next. She just lived every moment, every second with him. Their secret romance was like a smoldering fire that they couldn't put out even if they wanted to. It was something more than themselves, and they both knew it. So the months passed. Their bond grew stronger, but at the same time, beneath the surface of their passion, a sense of anxiety slowly grew. Amina couldn't get rid of the thought that this couldn't last forever. No matter how they hide their connection, sooner or later the world will invade their little world. But as long as they were alone, in this house, in the shadows of the forest, everything seemed possible. And they continued to live in this feeling, enjoying every moment, knowing that one day it would end. The summer came to an end, and with his passing, something began to slowly but inexorably change. In a house where silence and hidden passion reigned, there was a feeling of inevitability. It was as if the invisible force that had previously united them and given them time to hide from reality was now opening its arms, releasing disturbing premonitions. Amina felt it almost physically. Her condition has changed. What used to seem exciting to her has now become a cause for concern. She could no longer enjoy the quiet moments next to Samson, because each of them was overshadowed by the shadow of what was to come. The future, which had seemed unimportant before, suddenly began to loom over her like an ominous cloud. She understood that their bond could not exist forever in this closed world. Samson has changed too. He became more detached. His gaze, which had previously been permeated with silent passion, was now more often turned to nowhere. He spent a lot of time alone, going somewhere in the woods or locking himself in his room. Amina felt that something was bothering him, but he did not share his thoughts with her. No matter how hard she tried to figure out what was going on in his head, she remained in the dark. Autumn brought with it a dramatic change in their lives. Cold rains and thick fog have now become constant companions of the house. The surrounding world, which once seemed like a shelter, was now turning into a closed trap. Amina felt trapped here, as if in a cage, although only recently this place had been her refuge. Everything that connected her to this house began to lose its power. The silence that used to bring peace now pressed down on her, as if nature itself was trying to destroy this world. Samson began to appear less frequently. He went into the woods more and more often, leaving Amina alone for long hours. She knew something was going on, but she couldn't find an explanation for it. At times she felt that their secret romance was just an illusion, a temporary shelter from real life, which inevitably caught up with them. But as soon as she saw him, all those doubts receded, replaced by the very feelings that she could no longer control. But something inside her began to change. One morning, when Samson left again, Amina was left alone in the house, looking out the window at the grey rain that had not stopped for several days. She felt an inexplicable longing. She no longer saw joy in those slow, silent days. It seemed that every day was similar to the previous one, but with each new day, a bigger crack appeared between them. Amina spent her time wandering around the house, touching things that now seemed alien to her. She remembered how it all started, how her heart fluttered in anticipation of each meeting with Samson, but now that feeling was dissolving. Every object, every detail of this house now seemed to her to be just decorations designed to hide them from the outside world. But this world, no matter how far away it was, began to penetrate her consciousness again. Her thoughts increasingly returned to the life she had left behind. Her parents, friends, studies, all this now seemed to her something ghostly, but at the same time more real than what surrounded her here. This feeling of duality, of uncertainty about where her real self was eating away at her from the inside. She could no longer ignore this internal conflict. Her heart was torn between two worlds, the world she had created here, with Samson, and the world that was waiting for her outside. Samson seemed to feel the same way. He became more and more withdrawn, avoided her gaze, and sometimes just disappeared for days at a time. His face was becoming more and more pale and tired, as if something was devouring him from the inside. Amina saw how he was changing. but she couldn't find a way to help him or herself. Their passion, which used to unite them, now turned into a barrier separating them from each other. They were bound by something that was now beginning to destroy them. A few weeks passed and Samson fell ill. At first, these were only faint signs of slight cough, fatigue, but gradually his condition worsened. He became weaker, lay in bed more often, and his eyes dimmed, losing the spark that had once attracted Amina. She tried to take care of him, stayed by his side, but felt that her efforts were in vain. The disease seemed to take away not only his powers, but also the bond that existed between them. Samson was getting quieter every day. He no longer looked at her the way he used to, and even his silence was different now, cold, detached, as if he had already accepted the inevitable and was no longer trying to fight. Amina felt like something was leaving their lives, but she couldn't stop it. A feeling of helplessness grew inside her, and this helplessness began to turn into despair. Her nights became sleepless. She lay in bed, listening to the ticking of an old clock, and felt her life crumble. Everything she had built with Samson now seemed ghostly to her, as if their relationship existed only in her imagination. She could no longer find the strength to believe in their future, because that future was getting darker and darker. Taking care of the sick Samson consumed her time and energy, but she knew that it would not help anymore. He was fading before her eyes, and every day she saw in him less of the man who had captured her heart. The disease not only took away his physical strength, but also destroyed his soul, that part of him that was once full of vitality. Amina felt more and more lonely, even being with him. The silence that used to be their ally has now turned into an enemy. Every day she spent in this house, she felt this silence pressing down on her. She couldn't stand it anymore. Every morning when she woke up and heard the soft sounds of his cough from the next room, she felt her heart clench in anticipation of the inevitable. Everything that had been between them was now slowly crumbling, like an old house that loses its footing and begins to sink under its own weight. One day, when Samson was particularly weak, Amina, sitting by his bed, suddenly realized that their romance had come to an end. This realization came to her unexpectedly, like a bolt from the blue, but it was inevitable. Everything that connected them was now destroyed by disease and time. She could no longer feel the passion that used to rage in her chest, because now there was only a bitter sense of loss in its place. Samson hardly spoke. His breathing became heavy, and every breath was difficult for him. Amina understood that he didn't have much time left. She didn't know what to do with this realization. All she could do was stay close, hoping that her presence would bring him some comfort. She sat by his bedside, looking at his face, which was now only a shadow of the man she knew. There was no longer the depth in his eyes that had captivated her once. Now there was only calmness in them, as if he had already accepted his end and accepted it. This humility tore Amina apart. She couldn't accept losing him, but she couldn't change anything. The days passed. Samson was weakening, and his life was slowly fading away. Amina no longer found solace either in the house or in their silent memories. Everything they had turned to dust, like autumn leaves flying in the wind. She knew that the end was near, but she was unable to face it with composure. She spent days and nights at his bedside, watching him slowly fade away, and felt that a part of her soul was leaving with him. Everything they had created together was now crumbling before her eyes, and she couldn't hold on to it. The world they had created together was slowly disappearing like shadows at sunset. November came, and the world around Samson's house was plunged into impenetrable grey darkness. The wind was now relentlessly tearing at the windows, stripping the leaves from the trees and carrying them around the yard like meaningless, forgotten memories. Rain and cold became constant companions of life in the house, and Amina, sitting by the window, often watched as drops of water ran down the glass, merging into streams that disappeared somewhere below. This monotonous picture plunged her into a state of deep stupor from which there was no escape. Samson spent more and more time in bed. His strength was leaving him, as if every drop of life was flowing away as slowly as water on the glass outside the window. Every morning he became weaker, and Amina recognized him less and less as the man with whom she had once had their secret affair. His body was exhausted, his skin became thin and transparent, like paper, through which one could see every breath, every moment that still connected him with this world. Amina took care of him almost without leaving his room. Now her days were filled with only one thing: caring for the man she loved, but who was already more a shadow than a living being. She changed the sweat-soaked sheets, brought food that he couldn't eat, and water that he hardly drank. Her every move was filled with pain and impotence. It was as if life itself, slipping away from him, was taking away her strength along with him. Every evening was a challenge. In those rare hours when Samson fell asleep, his breathing became increasingly hoarse and heavy. Sometimes Amina couldn't stand the sound and went out into the garden to forget at least for a moment what was going on inside. But even there, she couldn't help feeling that something was going away by the minute. The forest that had been her solace now seemed alien and dead, like this whole world surrounded by disease and death. Time ceased to exist for her. The days merged into one endless stream, the hours of caring for the dying Samson, short, intermittent moments of sleep, empty, cold sunrises and long, dreary nights. Sometimes she didn't even realize how much time had passed since his illness completely overshadowed their lives. She couldn't remember the last day when he was healthy and strong, when there was passion between them, not fear and pain. Her own body began to give up. Constant fatigue, lack of appetite and sleepless nights made her as much a shadow as Samson. She could no longer look at herself in the mirror. Her reflection became alien, as if another person was looking from the depths, exhausted and devastated. Her hair was fading, her eyes were sunken, and her skin was pale and cold to the touch. Her hands, which had once touched him tenderly, now seemed alien, dry and lifeless, as if they did not belong to her. The days passed. Samson could no longer get out of bed, and Amina felt that the end was near. She saw how his eyes dimmed, lost the fire that used to burn in them, even in the most difficult moments. Now it was as if he was tied to this world only by inertia. His body continued to exist, but his soul was already somewhere far away. She couldn't understand what was going on in his head these last few days, but she knew that he was no longer here with her. One evening, when the wind and rain were raging outside the window again, Amina felt that something had changed. She was sitting by his bed as usual, looking at his face, when she suddenly felt a sharp pain inside herself. It was a strange, inexplicable feeling, as if her own soul had responded to his fading. Samson lay motionless, his breathing barely audible, like the light whisper of the wind outside the window. At that moment, Amina realized that the end was already here. She tried to find the strength to accept the inevitable, but her mind was gripped by fear. It was not a fear of death, but of what would remain after it. Their relationship, so passionate and painful, should have ended, but she couldn't let him go. Amina felt her heart break from the fact that she was powerless to change anything. Night fell. The rain was roaring outside the window. The blows of the wind were getting stronger. There was absolute silence in the room, broken only by Samson's occasional, hoarse sighs. Amina sat by his bed, as always, and watched his chest rise and fall slowly, as if the very life in him was held on the thinnest thread. She couldn't look away, couldn't leave. It seemed that if she closed her eyes for even a second, she would miss the moment when he left. And this moment has come. Samson suddenly took a sharp breath. His body tensed, as if he was trying to say or do something but couldn't. Amina jumped up from her chair, her heart stopped. She saw his face contort into a silent scream, but the sound never came out. His hands clenched, his fingers gripped the sheets, and his whole body shivered as if from the cold. Amina felt her legs give way. She took a step forward, reached for him, but did not have time. His body suddenly relaxed, as if all the strength that still held him in this world had suddenly left him. His chest stopped rising, and his eyes, which were closed, no longer opened. Amina froze, unable to move. Her mind refused to accept what had happened, but her heart already knew that Samson was gone. She slowly knelt down next to his bed, her hands trembling and her eyes filled with tears. She pressed his cold hand to her face, trying to feel at least a drop of warmth that seemed to have long since left his body. A sharp sense of loss gripped her whole being. It wasn't just death. It was the end of everything they had once shared. Amina sat for so long, feeling neither time nor the surrounding reality. Her thoughts seemed to freeze together with her body, immersed in emptiness. She couldn't cry. The tears dried up even before her mind fully realized what had happened. There was only emptiness inside her, a painful, destructive emptiness from which it was impossible to hide. It took several hours before she was able to get up. The room became cold, but Amina did not feel it. She got up slowly, went to the window and looked out at the dark forest, which now seemed to her as dead as Samson. The wind was beating against the windows again, and she suddenly realized that this house would no longer be her refuge. Everything that connected her to this place died with him. A few days have passed. Amina couldn't leave the house right away. Her soul was devastated, and even physically she was barely alive. She did all the funeral preparations, but she did it like an automaton. Her actions were mechanical, lifeless, as if her body was just performing its duties, and her mind was somewhere far away, in another place that she could not find. When everything was finished and Samson was buried in a small cemetery near the house, Amina returned. She stood by his grave, feeling nothing. Even the pain that had plagued her for so long now seemed alien. She couldn't believe it was all real. It seemed that her whole life here with him was some kind of strange, painful dream that was finally over. That day, when she was packing her things, she found an old note that Samson had once left for her. There were only 2 African names in it, the meaning of which she did not know. This note seemed strange to her, but then she did not attach any importance to it. Now that he was dead, those names were the only mystery for her that she would never be able to solve. Amina left home feeling that she was leaving behind not just a home and memories, but also a part of her soul. She no longer knew where to go or what to do next. Her life, like her love for Samson, ended with his last breath. Amina left the house a few days after Samson's funeral. She did not leave any farewell notes behind her, did not look at the place that she once considered a refuge. The road led her along the forest, which still stood in its impenetrable silence. The forest no longer made her feel the way it had before. It seemed that he, like her heart, had faded away, having lost his former magic. She moved as if on autopilot, not noticing either the wind or the cold. Everything that was inside her turned into emptiness. The days after Samson's death merged into one continuous memory. Amina couldn't tell the time anymore. At first, she tried to arrange her life, to return to her old business, to her studies, friends and family. But whenever she tried to do something ordinary, her consciousness returned to the place where she had left a part of her soul. It wasn't simple longing, it was a deep, overwhelming pain of loss that tore at her from the inside, even when she tried to forget about the past. The world around her continued to move forward, but for Amina, everything froze. The people around her were smiling, talking, living their lives, and she felt like a stranger among them. It seemed that her soul had remained in the house where Samson's life had been extinguished, and now she was wandering around the world like a disembodied spirit, unable to find a place for herself. Those around her did not notice her inner pain. Outwardly, she looked like always, but inside something much more complicated was happening. There was something dark, unspoken bubbling in her heart, and this darkness was growing stronger every day. Every evening, Amina returned to the moment when she sat by Samson's bedside in his last moments. Every evening she relived his death, felt the cold of his hand again, and watched his life go away with his last breath. Her mind was playing tricks on her. Even in her sleep, she couldn't get rid of this vision. From that terrifying feeling that they hadn't managed to do something important, that their relationship was doomed from the very beginning. These memories weighed on her, crowding out everything else. It took several weeks after Samson's death before Amina dared to return to the old note she found in his belongings after he left. 2 African names written in his handwriting haunted her thoughts. She held this note in her hands when she returned to her small house in the city, but could not bring herself to read it again. At that time, these names seemed strange to her, incomprehensible, and had nothing to do with her. But now that Samson was gone, they took on a new, frightening meaning. One night, when insomnia got the better of her again, she finally decided to find out what these words meant. The internet and books did not give her a definite answer, but she managed to find out one thing: these names were often used in African cultures to refer to children. This fact hit her like a blow to the chest. She realized that Samson had written down these names for a reason. These were the names of their future children, the ones they would never see. This discovery shocked her to the core. Her mind, which had been clinging to the remnants of common sense until that moment, could not accept this fact. They never talked about the children, never planned their future, because their romance itself was dangerous, secret, forbidden. But now, after his death, it became clear that Samson saw their life together much further than she could have imagined, and it tore her apart. With each passing day, the realization that their future had never come became unbearable for her. Amina tried to forget herself in everyday life, trying to distract herself, but she could not escape from the clutches of these thoughts. She couldn't think of anything else anymore. These 2 names, mysterious and beautiful, have become a symbol of everything she has lost and what she will never be able to regain. Soon her physical condition began to deteriorate. Constant fatigue, insomnia, and inability to eat had exhausted her body. She hardly left the house, avoided meetings with friends and family who were trying to figure out what was happening to her. But they couldn't help. Amina couldn't tell anyone the truth. Her story seemed too scary and incredible. She carried this pain inside herself, not sharing it with others. Over time, her health deteriorated completely. She could no longer get out of bed in the morning. Her body became weak. Her thoughts were confused. She lay in her room, lost in memories, and eventually realized that she no longer wanted to continue. Everything that was important to her went with Samson. Without him, her life seemed empty, meaningless. Even those fleeting moments of joy that she had experienced before meeting him now seemed like an illusion. Amina stopped fighting. Her spirit was broken, her body exhausted. She knew she couldn't go on with this knowledge, the knowledge that she could have children, a family, a life she would never have. She no longer saw the point of existing when everything she loved was lost forever. Her feelings for Samson did not weaken, but on the contrary, grew stronger as her own life slipped out of her hands. One morning, when the sun's rays barely penetrated through the curtains of her bedroom, Amina felt that her strength was leaving her completely. Her breathing became heavy and her heart was beating barely perceptibly. She no longer felt pain, only deep, overwhelming fatigue. It was like the very silence she had once felt in Samson's house, but now that silence was not cozy, but empty, devoid of hope. Her last thoughts were about how they could have lived together if things had been different. Her imagination conjured up an image of a house full of light and warmth, where she and Samson could meet old age together, surrounded by children whose names he had once written down for her. But this picture was ghostly. She knew she would never be able to make it a reality. Her eyes slowly closed, and she felt her consciousness slipping into a dark, silent world. Now she was free from pain, from memories, from the weight of loss. At the last moment before everything went out, she saw the image of Samson, who looked at her with tenderness, as then, in the early days of their love, he held out his hand to her, and she took it, walking away into the darkness where she thought they could meet again. Amina did not wake up the next morning. Her body was found lifeless, but there was a quiet, almost peaceful smile on her face. It seemed that she had finally found the peace that had been unavailable to her for a long time. Her story, full of passion, pain and loss, was over. But there was something deeper in this death, a release from the burden she had carried since Samson's death. Her funeral was modest. Few people knew about her life, and no one knew about her suffering. She left as quietly as she had lived the last months of her life alone, taking with her the secret of their forbidden romance. No one found out why she faded away so suddenly, and no one suspected the depth of her love and pain. The two names she had once found in Samson's note remained an unsolved mystery to everyone who knew her. But for Amina, these names became a symbol of her life, a life could have been, but never happened.